Harlan Pierce had lived in the same quiet Chicago neighborhood for more than 50 years, the kind where the sidewalks cracked in winter and everyone knew which porch light meant fresh coffee was brewing. At 78, he moved slowly, his knees complaining every step, but he kept his small red brick bungalow tidy since his wife Margaret passed away 3 months earlier. Losing her had been like losing the air itself, and though he tried to keep busy, fixing a loose gate, sweeping the porch, her absence lingered in every corner. One chilly Tuesday morning, while sorting through Margaret's hallway drawer, Harlan found something he'd never seen before. A heavy brass key with a small metal tag engraved with the word Garage Wabash. He stared at it for a long moment, confused. They didn't own a garage on Wabash Avenue, and Margaret had never mentioned one. When he mentioned it to his neighbor Carl over coffee later that day, Carl raised an eyebrow and said, "You mean the one she drove to every Thursday for years? Thought you knew." Harlan didn't. That night, he barely slept, the key sitting on the kitchen table like it was watching him. The next morning, he took the train downtown, his breath puffing in the cold, and found the address etched on the tag, an old brick building squeezed between a shuttered hardware store and an empty laundromat. The realtor he'd contacted to sell the property had told him it might be worth something, depending on what's inside. The steel door was stiff, the key grinding in the lock before giving way with a reluctant groan. A gust of cold, stale air hit him as he stepped inside. Dust coated the concrete floor, and thin lines of sunlight slipped through high, dirty windows. Harlan expected to see boxes of Margaret's old things, maybe tools or broken furniture. Instead, his eyes froze on the walls. Every inch was covered in photographs pinned in neat rows, not of family birthdays or vacations, but of strangers. Men in tailored suits shaking hands, women in dark coats stepping out of expensive cars, shadowed figures standing at street corners. And in almost every photograph was Margaret, sometimes in the background, sometimes close enough to see her sharp eyes and serious expression. She wasn't smiling, she wasn't posing, she was watching. The air felt heavier the longer he stood there. He noticed dates scrawled on the backs of some pictures, some going back 20 years, others as recent as last summer. In the center of the room sat an old steel desk, its drawers swollen with age, and Harlan felt a pull toward it. His hands trembled as he reached for the top drawer, the cold metal handle biting into his fingers. He didn't know what he would find, but the thought that his gentle, pie-baking, church-going wife might have been living a secret life made his chest tighten. As the drawer slid open, the scent of old paper and machine oil filled his nose, and for the first time since she died, Harlan felt something stronger than grief. He felt a chill of fear. Harlan stood in the cold stillness of the garage, his breath visible in the pale light streaming through the grimy windows. The top drawer of the steel desk was stuffed with folders, each labeled in Margaret's neat handwriting. Councilman Reed, Keller Construction, Midway Trust Bank, Wabash Union. Some folders were thick with photographs and stapled receipts. Others held typed pages with names, dates, and amounts in bold. At the bottom of one stack, he found a large envelope marked Insurance in red ink. Inside were copies of property deeds, ledgers of offshore accounts, and unsigned contracts, all with a faint smell of cigarette smoke. None of it made sense to him at first, until he recognized a name from the news. A developer accused of bribery years ago who had mysteriously been cleared. Margaret had been collecting evidence, but for what purpose? As he turned the pages, Harlan's hands began to shake, and a photo slipped out. It showed a group of suited men outside a courthouse, and on the edge of the frame stood Margaret, partially hidden by a pillar, watching them. She looked younger, but the expression on her face was not casual. It was calculating. The sound of a drawer creaking pulled him back. He opened the middle one, which was heavier, and found a small metal cash box with a keyhole. The brass key from the Wabash tag didn't fit, but the ring on the desk held a smaller silver key. It clicked, and the lid popped open to reveal a single cassette tape labeled for Harlan. His chest tightened as he placed it into the old tape player sitting on the desk, dust puffing out as he pressed play. Margaret's voice filled the garage, warm but firm. "Harlan, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone. There's something I never told you. Do you remember when the factory shut down? When our pension disappeared? When you ended up in the hospital because the stress nearly killed you? They did that to you, Harlan. The men in those files. And they thought I would forgive them. I didn't. I've been collecting everything. Names, deals, bribes for over 20 years. I was careful, but if they find out you have this, they will come after you. I didn't tell you before because I wanted you safe. Now it's your choice. You can burn it all, or you can finish what I started. She paused, and her voice softened. They hurt you, Harlan, and they hurt a lot of other people. I couldn't let that go. Maybe I'm asking too much, but you deserve the truth. The tape clicked off, leaving only the hum of the fluorescent bulb overhead. Harlan sat there for a long time, the cassette still spinning in the player. He thought about the years he'd spent patching roofs, driving delivery trucks, doing whatever work he could after the factory shut down. He thought about how Margaret had always insisted on handling the bills, how she'd take errands every Thursday, never saying where she went. And he thought about the men in those folders, men who had shaken hands with politicians and smiled for cameras while families like his had lost everything. His grief felt different now, heavier but sharper, and underneath it was something he hadn't felt in years: anger. He pushed the desk drawer closed and stood, his knees aching, but his mind suddenly alert. If Margaret had kept this a secret for decades, there had to be a reason, and that reason was sitting all around him in piles of paper and photographs. As he turned toward the garage door, movement outside caught his eye. A dark sedan idling on the opposite side of the street. The windows were tinted, but he was certain the driver was watching him. He locked the garage door, pocketed the tape, and walked down the cracked sidewalk to the bus stop, forcing himself not to look back. By the time he returned home, his hands were cold and stiff, but his mind was racing. He brewed coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the brass key. The garage was no longer just a storage space. It was a vault of secrets, and now it was his responsibility. That night, he called Claire, his niece, the only family member he trusted completely. When she heard the tension in his voice, she came right over. Harlan didn't tell her everything at first, only that he'd found something Margaret had been hiding for years. But when he played her the tape, she went pale. "Uncle, this is dangerous," she said quietly. "Those names in the files, they're not small-time crooks. They're the kind of people who make problems disappear." Harlan sipped his coffee, his eyes fixed on the tabletop. "Then maybe it's time they had a problem they couldn't make disappear," he said. The next morning, Harlan woke to the sound of his phone ringing, the old rotary bell sharp in the quiet kitchen. He answered, his voice still rough from sleep. "Mr. Pierce," a man said smoothly, "I think you have something of ours." Harlan didn't reply right away. The man continued, "Files, photographs, documents you're not authorized to keep. You should bring them to me before this gets unpleasant." There was no introduction, no name, and before Harlan could ask, the line went dead. He sat there for a moment, the receiver heavy in his hand, then slowly set it back in place. 20 minutes later, Claire arrived with 2 paper bags of groceries, her eyes narrowing when she saw his face. "Who called?" she asked. Harlan told her, and her jaw tightened. "We can't wait for them to come knocking. We have to protect the files." Together, they loaded the folders, photographs, and the cassette tape into a large canvas bag. Claire drove them to a small copy shop on the west side she used for her business, where they made duplicate sets of everything. One set went into Claire's backpack, another into a locked briefcase Harlan had kept since the 1980s. As they left the shop, Harlan noticed a black SUV parked across the street, the driver pretending to read a newspaper. That night, he and Claire spread the documents across the dining room table, sorting through them piece by piece. Harlan began to see a pattern. Construction permits pushed through by bribes, pension funds siphoned off into shell companies, city contracts awarded to friends of friends. Many of the names had faces he recognized from Margaret's photographs. And then he found something that made his hands go cold. A series of handwritten notes in Margaret's tidy script, all dated in the months before she died. They listed meeting places, coded references like Green Bench, 2 p.m., and Vault Key with Reed. Claire leaned over his shoulder. "That's Councilman Reed. He's still in office," she said. Harlan remembered Reed as the young, smiling politician who'd toured the factory floor just before the closure, promising jobs would be safe. Now, in Margaret's notes, his name was linked to offshore transfers and false invoices. She was tracking them, Harlan murmured, right up until... He didn't finish. Claire quietly took a photo of the page with her phone. Later, as they boxed up the papers again, Harlan made a decision. If they think I'm just some old man who'll hand this over, they're wrong. We're going to let them know we're not afraid. The following morning, he typed an anonymous letter on his old typewriter. Inside, he placed copies of the most damaging pages, enough to rattle nerves, but not enough to give away the full collection. He addressed it to a local investigative reporter known for taking down corrupt officials and mailed it from a post office 2 neighborhoods over. By evening, the news was buzzing with hints of a major leak involving Chicago's political elite. That same night, another call came. This time, the man identified himself. "Victor Crane," he said, his tone less polite. "You've made a mistake, Mr. Pierce. I know you're the one who sent those papers. I know you have more. You're in over your head." Harlan's voice stayed calm. "Maybe, or maybe I'm exactly where I need to be." Crane let the silence stretch before replying, "You have 48 hours to return everything, or you won't like the alternative." The line clicked dead. Claire, who'd been listening on the extension, whispered, "They're scared. That's why they're pushing." Harlan leaned back in his chair, staring at the bag of files in the corner. Margaret had built this archive for a reason, not to hide it forever, but to use it. And now the choice wasn't just about finishing what she started. It was about protecting himself, Claire, and maybe everyone else those men had crushed over the years. He knew the danger was real. He could feel it in the way the air seemed heavier, the way shadows lingered outside the house longer than they should. But something inside him had shifted. The grief that had kept him bent over and quiet since Margaret's death was now joined by a steady heat. They had taken his future once. He wasn't about to let them take the last of his life without a fight. 2 days later, the cold wind off Lake Michigan bit through Harlan's coat as he and Claire stepped out of a taxi in front of Federal Trust, a quiet brick building sandwiched between a law office and an old tailor shop. Claire had discovered a small silver key in one of Margaret's envelopes, attached to a tag marked FTSD box, and she was certain it belonged here. Inside, the air was warm and faintly scented with polish and paper. The vault manager examined the key, checked Harlan's ID, and led them down a narrow hallway lined with steel doors. "This box hasn't been opened in years," he remarked before leaving them alone in the chilled, silent room. Harlan slid the key into the lock, his hand trembling, and the box slid forward with a metallic scrape. Inside was no money, no jewelry, just a manila folder and a single black flash drive. Claire opened the folder carefully. It was filled with signed agreements, bank records, and a page in bold red letters reading, "Crane Blackmail Insurance." Harlan lifted the flash drive, its surface unmarked, and slipped it into his coat pocket without opening it. "She had them cornered," Claire whispered. "This is leverage." As they left the vault, Harlan noticed a figure leaning casually against a lamppost across the street, watching them. It was the same man from the black SUV days earlier. He said nothing, but the faint smile he gave as they passed sent a shiver through Harlan's spine. Back at the bungalow, they spread the new contents on the kitchen table alongside the rest of Margaret's files. Harlan realized she hadn't just gathered evidence, she'd organized it so someone could strike when the timing was right. He thought about Crane's threat, about the faceless men in her photographs, about Reed's name written over and over in her neat cursive. "We can't sit on this," Harlan said finally. "The longer we wait, the more control they have." Claire nodded. They decided on a 2-step move. First, deliver enough of the material anonymously to force the people in the documents to turn against each other. Second, hold back the worst of it as insurance. That night, Claire used an old laptop, disconnected from the internet, to copy the flash drive. She didn't open any files, just made duplicates and stored them on 2 separate USBs. One went into a safety deposit box she rented in her own name. The other she gave to Harlan, who tucked it inside an envelope labeled "In Case of Emergency" and placed it under a loose floorboard in his bedroom. The following morning, they mailed thick, unmarked envelopes to 3 addresses: a whistleblower attorney, a state corruption task force, and the same investigative reporter Harlan had contacted before. Within 24 hours, the news cycle was rumbling again. Mentions of undisclosed financial documents, potential bribery investigations, and unconfirmed links to high-ranking officials. That evening, Harlan's phone rang once more. It was Crane, his tone now sharper, the charm gone. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but this ends now," he said. Harlan answered slowly, "No, it doesn't. It ends when you leave me, Claire, and the rest of the people you hurt alone. Permanently." Crane chuckled without humor. "You're playing with fire, old man." Harlan didn't raise his voice. "Then you'd better hope I don't drop the match." After the call, he sat in the quiet living room, the street lamp outside casting long shadows on the walls. For the first time, he understood that Margaret's work hadn't just been about revenge. It had been about giving him the means to choose how the story ended. And now, with every step they took, the balance of power was shifting. A week later, Harlan found a plain white envelope in his mailbox, no return address, the paper thick and slightly creased. Inside was a single sheet listing 6 names in black ink, each with a red checkmark, except the last, Councilman Reed. Beneath his name was a time and place, Wednesday, 2 p.m., Lincoln Park, the bench by the fountain. Harlan showed it to Claire, who urged him to ignore it, but he shook his head. "Margaret wanted this finished," he said. On Wednesday, the sky hung low and gray over the city, the wind carrying the scent of damp leaves as Harlan walked slowly through the park. Reed was already on the bench, bundled in a heavy coat, his eyes darting at every passerby. "I got your message," Reed muttered as Harlan sat beside him. Harlan slid a small envelope across the bench without looking at him. "Copies of every bribe you took, every illegal contract you signed. If I don't make it home today, they go straight to the press." Reed's hand shook as he took the envelope. "What do you want?" Harlan looked out at the fountain, its water rippling in the wind. "I want you out. Resign tomorrow. And I want you to set up a fund for the factory families. Use your own money. No delays, no excuses." Reed swallowed hard, nodding. "You don't understand," he said. "If I do that, they already will," Harlan cut in. "The difference is, this way, you get to walk away." 2 days later, Reed announced his resignation on live television, citing personal reasons and health concerns. A week after that, a quiet fund appeared under the name of an anonymous donor, offering financial relief to dozens of former factory workers. Sitting at his kitchen table, Harlan read the news with a slow, quiet satisfaction. That evening, Claire arrived with 2 mugs of coffee and a small box. Inside was a polished wooden plaque she'd had made. "In memory of Margaret Pierce, Truth Wins." They hung it on the wall above the desk where the files now sat in organized folders, sealed and labeled, with copies hidden safely away. "You know," Claire said, "you could walk away now. Sell the garage, live in peace." Harlan shook his head with a faint smile. "Peace doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from knowing they can't touch you anymore." As night fell, he walked to the garage one last time, standing in the center of the room surrounded by Margaret's careful work. The photographs, the notes, the smell of old paper and dust. It was no longer just her secret world. It was a monument to the years they had survived and to the quiet war she had waged. Locking the door, he handed the keys to the realtor the next morning. "Sell it," he said, "but tell the buyer this place has history." As he walked away under the sharp winter sun, the weight in his chest felt lighter. Margaret's plan was complete, and in finishing it, he had reclaimed the last piece of himself they had tried to take. Somewhere out there, Crane and his men were watching, waiting for a sign of weakness, but Harlan knew they would not dare move against him now. The files were his shield, and the truth was his weapon.